Welcome to the Leigh-on-Sea History Channel, where we walk the seashore of the past. Centrally placed at the heart of the High Street is the Strand Wharf, which as early as medieval times was a focal point of village life. Strand Wharf is documented as early as 1255, when Beatrice, the daughter of Henry III, tried unsuccessfully to elope at Hadleigh with one Ralph de Binley. De Binley had been accused of killing a foreign merchant on the Strand and was subsequently exiled from England. Beatrice later married her father's preferred choice of husband in France. In the 14th century, Leigh was a busy trading port on the Kent, Rayleigh, Chelmsford and Pleshy route, and by the 15th century it had an important coastal trading role at a time when inland communications were still very primitive and slow. Sea trade had increased so much that by 1565 a customs officer was appointed. In that same year, a fellow customs officer at Harwich reported that Leigh is a very proper town, well furnished with good mariners, where commonly tall ships do ride, which town is a common and special landing place for butter, all manner of grain and other things. As we have seen in our Lords of the Manor and Leigh Hall video, the cottages on the wharf belonged to the Lords of the Manor and were once a part of Anne Boleyn's dowry when the property was in the hands of her father, Thomas. Shortly after this, it became the prerogative of the Master of Trinity House, the local guild of pilots, to live on Strand Wharf. Seen here on the eastern side of the Strand, these three cottages were formerly one house when they were the residence of Richard Chester, who lived here in 1615 when he was Master of Trinity House. Chester died in 1632. By 1790, Richard Chester's house on the Strand had already been divided into three tenements. Canon John Bundock reproduces a section about these cottages that were very close to the water. It is taken from the report of the Royal Commission on Historical Monuments that describes the property as house, now three tenements, 40 yards east-south-east of the Crooked Billet, which has modern additions at the back. Inside the building is an original staircase with a central newel, and the roof retains a queen post truss with cambered tie beams, curved wind braces and octagonal queen posts. The queen post truss would have looked something like this. Bundock states that under the chimney to the left of the picture was the original Tudor brick fireplace. He actually witnessed the demolition of these buildings during or just after World War II. He notes ruefully, in 1923, the Royal Commission for Historical Monuments listed 7 Leigh buildings other than St Clement's, but by 1978, only 2 remained, the Crooked Billet and the Customs House. 100 years on from that report, these 2 buildings are thankfully still here. Here, Chester's house can be seen behind the town's second well, with its water pump enclosed by railings. Because it had remained in the hands of the Lords of the Manor, Strand Quay was freely available for public use, unlike the other landing sites which were in private hands. The Strand was the main importing wharf in the town at a time when 21 merchant ships were named as belonging solely to Leigh in the reign of James I, 1603 to 25. Only Harwich had more ships in England during this period, with 31. On the 5th of October 1651, a bylaw was presented that stated that if any vessel or vessels shall come with any commodities to sell at the Strand Quay to the inhabitants of the town of Leigh, it shall pay towards the maintaining of the quay 4d. a time for every such vessel that cometh with fish or malt, for vessels that come with coals 2d. a time under the name of wharfage. One James Steele was appointed the collector of wharfage. One record from 1639 shows that it was not unusual to have a remarkable 200 coal ships lying at anchor off the Leigh coast. Sometime before 1655, a rate was imposed on the town for the repair of Strand Quay. As the town's fortunes declined and the harbour became silted up, the payment of this toll must have ceased, but exactly when is unknown. However, between 1727 and 1729, the amounts to be collected had become so small it can have no longer been worth the cost of enforcing the payment. Among the items frequently listed at this time were cauliflowers, cherries, mackerel, brandy, malt, sprats, herrings, hay, calves, and somewhat intriguingly, Madam Hutton's household goods. There are several references to landings by smugglers and smugglers' yachts. However, smuggling in the old town will be the subject of a separate video. In this photo, we see a detail of the custom house from a photo taken in the 1920s. At this time, it appears to be operating as a shop. To the right is the roof of Cook's Place. To the left of the custom house would have been the Crown Inn, which we touched on briefly in part 1. In this photo, we see the home of Robert Salmon, who is commemorated in St Clement's, who bequeathed the building in his will of 1591 to his wife Agnes. My house called Cups, standing by the Strand for life. In 1657, the house was being occupied by one of his sons, Peter, who had been educated at Eton and Cambridge and was a physician of some note, being, as he was, the doctor to King Charles I. It is likely that this good doctor was the last in the male Salmon line to live in this house. Here we see the High Street from the northwestern corner of the Strand, taken by Paddy Ballard in 1982. In the distance we can see the Peterboat Inn. In these other excellent photos taken by Paddy in 1978, we see the old cottages that stood on Strand Wharf just prior to their restoration by the Leigh Society. These probably stood behind Richard Chester's former house. Old photos of the Foreshore show how tightly clustered together buildings were in the late 19th and early 20th century. On the southwestern edge of the Strand is Alley Dock, running between the river and a row of Edwardian cottages. At the eastern end, there were once stables for the horses that used to pull wagon loads of goods from the wharves up Lee Hill, which was locally known as Horse Hill. At one time, Alley Dock was the location of some of the most squalid dwellings in the old town. At the western end, just before the Peterboat, there used to be a communal toilet that overhung the sea wall. There was also an early town jail situated here. Over time, the foreshore has looked very different than it does today, with buildings right up to the waterfront, as these photos show. Here, Paddy Ballard captures the building of the new sea wall in 1983 that changed the entire look of the foreshore over 40 years ago. In this other photo, he captures Theobald's Wharf as it once was. In this unmistakably 1960s photograph, the foreshore can be seen from the road bridge that was at that time less than 10 years old. Seen here looking east and on the south side of the High Street is the original Peterboat Inn. It was first built in 1645 and run by members of the Osborne family for many, many years, including 3 successive generations, all called John. In 1892, the landlord is thought to have tripped on the stairs and dropped an oil lamp. The entire building and some of the cottages beyond it to the right were burnt to the ground. The people of Leigh found it impossible to fight such a large fire themselves, and one Herbert Brewer, whose family lived nearby, rode a horse barebacked all the way to Southend to call the Southend Fire Brigade. The then newly commissioned steam-powered fire engine, the Alert, was called into action for the first time, and according to the Southend Standard, it is said to have arrived within 15 minutes, but this cannot have included Brewer's mad dash to Southend. After the fire, ancient secret smuggling tunnels were discovered in the basement that led to the river. Here is the same view pictured by Paddy in 1978. On the right is the rebuilt Peterboat, and beyond that, Reginald and Theobald cottages that replaced the ones destroyed by fire. The Peterboat has been a popular destination for locals and day trippers alike, and like one of our subscribers, William, who was born at Leigh, many a first pint have been drunk here. Here is the Peterboat car park, probably taken in the 1940s or early 1950s. The Peterboat is named after the Peterboats, the fishing boats found on the Thames estuary and nearby coasts of southern England. The mudflats of Leigh and Shoebury Ness were a rich source of sole, turbot, whiting and flounder, and were a popular fishing ground. Writing in 1722, Daniel Defoe noted that the flats are so full of fish that the whole shore is full of small fisher boats in very great numbers, belonging to the villages and towns on the coast, who come at every tide. A great deal of this catch was landed at Leigh. The principal market for Leigh's fishing catch was, of course, London, and before the coming of the railway, with the roads in poor condition, the fish were sent upriver to Billingsgate Market. In bad weather, when sailing upriver was impossible, 7 large holding pits on the marshes were utilised. These were also kept as a reserve for when fish stocks were low, when they could be sold at very high prices. They remained in use until the end of the 19th century. Seen here looking west in 1978 are the buildings on the north side of the High Street opposite the Peterboat. On the extreme right of the picture are 2 cottages that once saw use as the United Brethren Beer House. This somewhat religious name came about because the brewery was owned by 2 brothers, Charles and Joseph Gray. Originally 2 cottages of lath and plaster and said to date back to 1600, the building was converted by Richard Thorne into a beer house by joining the 2 houses together and bricking the front. Following the closure of the beer house, the property was converted into 2 shops that were used by the Southend Marine Engineering Company, as seen in these images. Today, they are once again separate private cottages. Next to the former beer house is the workshop of the old Southend Marine Engineering Company workshop, which is now the Old Leigh Studios Gallery, where local legend and artist Sheila Appleton has worked for a great many years. Seen here in 1978 before it became an art gallery, the former shops can be seen quite clearly. In March 1917, Arthur "Sonny" Joscelyne, whose family owned Joscelyne's Beach at Chalkwell, was apprenticed here to Mr. Davis, the owner of the Southend Marine Engineering Company. Following his father's death, Arthur would run the private beach for many years with his mother. Their story will be the subject of a separate video. In 1748, fishermen from Leigh were in Southampton and came across John Wesley preaching in the town and asked him to come to Leigh. As we have already seen, Wesley made at least 6 visits to the village between 1748 and 1756. Impressed by his teachings, a Methodist society was formed, and in 1819 a chapel was built. Canon John Bundock numbered it number 13 on his map. Marked here with an X is the area that led up to the original Methodist meeting house. This photograph was taken in 1978 by Paddy Ballard. Today it looks like this, but the meeting house was probably between the hedge and the palm tree on the opposite side of the railway. It probably stood on land occupied by the railway and new road. Demolished to make way for the railway in 1854, another unknown meeting house was used on the High Street when the minister was one Joseph Guttick. Eventually, a new chapel was built in the new road in 1879. 50 years later, this building had been made so unstable by vibrations from the railway, it too was demolished. The current Methodist chapel, known as the Fisherman's Chapel, was built in 1932. The history of Methodism in Leigh and that of the present Wesley Church in Elm Road will feature in a separate video. Opposite the tiny access road that led to this chapel, on the south side of the High Street, is the Conduit House, which has in its enclosure a 5'6" bluestone pillar that was erected in the year 1712 to mark the head of a spring that bubbled out of the ground at the top of Billet Lane, near where it meets Rectory Grove. The spring was known locally as the Tickle, a corruption of tile, kiln and meadow, the place where the spring emerged. It is inscribed, "This stone is placed at ye springhead belonging to the Conduit, by the desire of the parishioners of Leigh, 1712. The Conduit referred phonetically to the conduit that by a series of cisterns fed a reservoir at the Conduit House that held 44 hogsheads of water. At some point the stone was moved from its original location and placed on the north side of Rectory Grove. In 1975, the local branch of the Royal Institute of British Architects marked European Heritage Year by restoring the Conduit House, and at the same time the marker stone was removed from Rectory Grove and taken to the Conduit House for safekeeping. The conduit was often blocked by weeds and rubbish. The pipework needed constant maintenance. A committee was set up to collect funds from parishioners, and a brick shelter was built around the reservoir that could be locked shut in order to ration water in hot weather. The pipework was repaired in February 1826, and the lead pipes were replaced by glazed pipe made by the local Phoenix pottery. Later renamed Victoria, the pottery will feature in a video of its own. A plaque above the grating states, "The works belonging to this spring having been destroyed were reinstated in 1825 by subscription and were placed by the vestry in the hands of a committee. Robert Eden, Chairman, 1846. Below that it states, "Waste not, want not." Next to the Conduit House is a building calling itself the Coal Hole, named after a famous Old Town pub, of which we will hear more in a moment. Moving a little further west along the northern side of the High Street, this 19th century illustration shows the western end of the High Street, and the only part in it that survives today is the Crooked Billet. The Crooked Billet sits at the end of Billet Lane, and when the railway first came, a level crossing was provided to connect the High Street with the lane that still runs up the hill. Seen here in the very early 20th century, on the left by the lamppost is a small plate layer's hut that was at one time manned by Isaac Spurgeon, who was the level crossing keeper. There are two girls seen collecting water, and there is also a small shop. The rather rustic-looking cottage up the hill on the right was once used as a local workhouse. The Royal Commission of 1923 described the Crooked Billet in the following way. It is of 2 stories with attics and was built probably late in the 16th century. It has been much altered and added to. There are 2 original chimney stacks, each with the 3 grouped diagonal shafts. Inside the building, on the ground floor, is an original fireplace with a 4-centred head. Just beyond the Crooked Billet was another beer house, the one known as the Coal Hole. This had originally been a private house known as Gilman's at the Pale. The Pale in question being the protective fence at the western end of Leigh. H.W. King, in his unpublished manuscripts held at the Essex Records Office, gives a detailed description of this building. He describes it as being perhaps the most ancient house remaining in Leigh, and it may be assigned to the reign of Queen Elizabeth I, if not older, as the fireplace is of the Tudor period. It had an overhanging upper story until quite recently, when it was faced with red bricks. The railway company acquired the property and severed the garden and orchard for their own use. After the Second World War, it was bought by Southend Council, who naturally immediately demolished it. Opposite the Crooked Billet is the Billet Wharf, seen here with the Crooked Billet in the background. On the east side of Billet Wharf stood the old weatherboarded building on the right, which was, according to Bundock, 16th or 17th century. The first image dates from about 1904, and this one some years later, probably the 1930s. Here is a close-up. Similar to Juniper's cottage discussed in part 1, the facade of this old building is being mocked by its replacement. Here are 2 photos of Billet Wharf taken by Paddy Ballard in 1978. The old cottage was described by Bundock as being not old. It is probably 19th century. Opposite the Coal Hole was the Leigh Gas, Light and Coke Company, underlined in black on the map here. Half of their large gas container can be seen in this 19th century illustration. The gas container was located roughly where the trees and the old buoy are located today. Here is the western end of the High Street looking east from a watercolour drawing by G.A. Fripp held at the Beercroft Gallery. Canon John Bundock describes it thus. It is dated 1852, and the author believes, by comparing it with maps and prints, that it is a fairly accurate presentation of that part of Leigh, as it was then. Gilman's at the Pale is on the left, and a house called Joan Bayliss is on the right. A fisherman is seen mending what might be a peter net. Fishermen mended their nets on that grass patch within living memory. The net may be hanging on the last relic of the Pale. The boats here are peter boats and pinkies. He then adds once more, all this is now torn down. Beyond the western edge of the High Street are the cockle sheds, which will be covered in our video about the history of fishing in Leigh. Beyond that is the present railway station. As we saw in part 1, there have been several stations in Leigh. The line opened in 1854, and for 2 years Leigh was actually the terminus, the extension to Southend only being completed some years later. The first station was located opposite the present Smack Inn, and later, as passenger numbers increased, the up platform heading west to London and its booking office were transferred in 1910 to the building now occupied by Leigh Sailing Club. There was a separate entrance and booking office for the down eastbound platform situated on New Road that has long since been demolished. Here we see a train steaming down through the old town to Southend. If you have ever wondered why there is a station road in Upper Leigh that has never been the home to a railway station, it is because the line was originally going to take a completely different route. From Benfleet, it was planned to climb the hills up to Hadleigh and then make its way to Leigh, probably close to the route of the A13. The railway company, however, felt the extra fuel involved in climbing such a steep gradient was not economically viable at a time when Hadleigh was a very small hamlet with a tiny population. This decision doomed the old town to be cut in half. Thank you very much for watching. Please like and subscribe and share this video on social media if you enjoyed it. If you have any friends who might enjoy this kind of content, please share it with them.